And now we're really going to move on, Ken, to stages which you call levels, waves,
Right.
structures. You use a
Right.
lot of different names.
Yeah, trying to confuse people at this point.
Exactly.
So I
Yeah,
threw in a
really.
lot of-
Why is that? All these different
everybody's
words
going,
for
it's
it.
much too simple up to this point, Ken. So I said, okay, watch this. And then I threw in all these terminology messes. Well, it's one of the interesting things as you sort of look at the natural world at all. There's kind of a growth and development that most organic processes go through. And we've kind of become accustomed to them under the general notion of evolution. But even a lot of the ancient traditions had a notion of interior growth and development. 7 chakras, for example, or 7 ways of increasing consciousness that you can develop in Kundalini Yoga, among other things. So when you get to stages, though, there are a lot of things you have to be really careful about. There are dozens of ways to do it wrong and really, really mess it up. Research is harder to come by, but it is there, and it's important to take into account, as long as we kind of hold these conceptions very lightly. And when it comes to whether we call it, we'll talk about stages and waves and what that means in a minute, but the number of them that we use are, again, just like Fahrenheit, centigrade. It doesn't really, you can divide it up almost any way you want. And you can take it to Gilligan's development where there are 3 major stages. Most moral developmentalists, including Gilligan, subdivide each of those into 2, so they're really 6 stage. That's okay. That's fine, as long as you know what you're doing and you sort of indicate ways to do that. The reason it's important is, well, first of all, it appears to be true. I mean, it appears to be out there actually happening. But one of the reasons it's really important is by tracing these higher, further reaches of growth, it shows human beings their higher possibilities, higher potentials that everybody has a capacity to grow into if, in fact, they grow. They keep growing. So then you want to be careful about it because you don't want to pigeonhole people, or you don't want to take somebody's response and say, well, that's clearly at a lower level. And I mean, we all know the problems that can happen with that. None of those problems excuse the fact that there might be real levels or stages going on here, and that if we want to take this into account, it can help our own growth. So let me just give a really quick example of how these stages are studied by, let's say, Western developmental psychologists. I'll use Carol Gilligan as an example. Because a lot of people get confused about why you use stages and what it means, and it just sounds horrible. It sounds very...
You sound like an elitist.
Elitist and fascist and Nazi and all sorts of things, which I, only on Tuesdays and Thursdays am I that horrible. Carol Gilligan, this is a standard way that developmental psychologists work. Gilligan took a group of women and asked a certain number of questions. And then what you do is you ask questions and you see what the responses are. And then you follow those responses over time and see if they change. So a typical question she asked is, does a woman have a right to an abortion? And she found 3, she asked all these women, and then she found 3 general answers. And the first answer was yes. And the second type of answer was no. And the third type of answer was yes. So the first yes was, yes, a woman has a right to abortion. Why? Because what I say is right, and therefore whatever I do is right, and therefore, fuck you, basically. So that's sort of the first response. The second response was, no, she doesn't have a right to an abortion. Why? Well, because what society says is, the law is the law, and you can't break the law. That would be awful. So no, she can't do that. It's against the Bible, it's against the law, it's against the Constitution. The third response is, yes, she has a right to that, even though it's very difficult, but there are larger principles involved, and you have to weigh different concerns, the woman's concerns, the fetus concerns, and so on. And under certain circumstances, the woman has a right to an abortion. So those are 3 classes, 3 types of responses. We just call them 1, 2, and 3 for right now. So you then follow this group over time. And what you find is that if the woman gave response 2, that if she changes her response, it's always to response 3 and not to response 1. In other words, there's a direction. And if anybody changes, they go to the next stage, they never go backwards. So you have a stage conception. You actually have stages that these responses go through. So then you're allowed to say, well, maybe there's a developmental sequence here. And that's what she found. And it's stage 1, selfish. What I say is right, to hell with you. Of course I can have an abortion. Stage 2 is care, but it's conformist. It's locked in the conventional level of development. So you care for others, but you can't break the law. That would be horrible. Stage 3 is universal care. Now you're caring about everybody. So you take the rights of the mother and the rights of the unborn into account. Difficult decision, but sometimes you would say yes, sometimes no, but a woman does have a right to an abortion under circumstances. So If you then follow that group, you never find them going the other direction, then you have a stage conception. And that's what developmental psychologists do. They look for these stages of unfolding in these modules, lines, capacities, intelligences. And there's an enormous amount of research on all of that. And they generally, now not everything goes through stages. We have yet to talk about types and states of consciousness, altered states, peak experience, and so on. Those don't go through stages. They kind of come and go on their own. They're kind of random. They do their own thing, stay a bit, move on. But a lot of the parts of the psyche, like a lot of parts of nature, grow and develop from acorn to oaks and eggs to chickens. There are certain stages of that unfolding, and developmental psychologists study that unfolding. Once they've studied in one group, they'll try looking at other groups. And once they've done that, they'll try looking at other cultures, and they trying to repeat it. Some stages just happen in some cultures. Some stages appear to be cross-cultural as far as we can tell, and those are more universal. But that's a matter for research. Nobody's imposing this. Nobody dreamt this stuff up and says everybody goes through these stages based on my preferences and stuff like that. So it's basically, any good developmental psychologist has done an enormous amount of research, and it's based on that. Then if you go back and look, though, you find really extraordinary stage conceptions that have been advanced throughout the years. Gene Gebser gave one that's become fairly famous. His general stages of cultural development were archaic, magic, mythic, rational, and integral, for example. And that's become fairly widespread and understood. But all of these things are based on a certain type of research. You want to be very, very careful about that. But the higher reaches of those stages start to look very, very spiritual, because they're starting to get very, very transpersonal. And at that point is where it really becomes interesting. And that's not the only route to spirit, so to speak. But one of the several definitions of spiritual is the highest levels of these different lines all start to get very, very spiritual looking.